the quiet farming community of Cedar Valley, Oregon, there lived two souls who had been marked by tragedy and misunderstood by the world around them. Their story would prove that sometimes the purest forms of communication happen without words, and that love can heal wounds that medicine and time cannot touch. Jayne Parker was 8 years old, with golden curls that caught the morning sunlight and bright blue eyes that held depths of understanding far beyond her years. She had been born without the ability to speak, her vocal cords damaged during a difficult birth that had nearly claimed both her and her mother's lives. While other children her age filled the world with chatter and laughter, Jayne moved through life in a bubble of silence that had taught her to see and feel things that others missed. Her parents, Sarah and Michael Parker, had moved to Cedar Valley 3 years earlier, hoping the small-town environment would provide Jayne with a peaceful place to grow up, where her differences wouldn't make her a target for cruel children's teasing. They had enrolled her in special education classes, learned sign language as a family, and surrounded her with all the love and support they could provide. But despite their efforts, Jayne remained isolated, struggling to connect with a world that seemed to move at a pace and volume she couldn't match. On the outskirts of Cedar Valley lived Frederico, a 900-pound Holstein bull whose beauty was matched only by his legendary temper. He belonged to the Riverside Dairy Farm, owned by the Williams family who had been working the same land for 4 generations. Frederico had once been the pride of their operation, a magnificent breeding bull with bloodlines that traced back to champion dairy cattle in Europe. His black and white coat gleamed like polished marble, and his massive frame commanded respect from every animal on the farm. But tragedy had struck Frederico 2 years earlier during a lightning storm that had killed 3 cows in his herd, including Bella, a gentle Holstein who had been his constant companion since calfhood. The trauma had transformed the once docile bull into a creature of unpredictable rage. He would charge at farm equipment, destroy fencing, and had become so dangerous that farm hands refused to enter his pasture without multiple people present and emergency protocols in place. "That bull's got the devil in him," said Tom Williams, the 70-year-old patriarch of the farm, shaking his head as he watched Frederico pace along the reinforced fence line. "Before the storm, he was gentle as a lamb. Kids could pet him. He'd follow you around like a dog. Now he's got hate in his eyes that I've never seen in any animal." The people of Cedar Valley had grown accustomed to the sound of Frederico's rage echoing across the valley. His bellowing could be heard for miles, a mournful, angry sound that seemed to express grief too deep for any creature to bear. Local veterinarians had tried everything from sedatives to behavior modification, but nothing could calm the massive bull's fury. Insurance companies had threatened to drop coverage, and animal control officers had suggested that euthanasia might be the most humane option. The Williams family faced an impossible decision. Frederico was worth tens of thousands of dollars as a breeding bull, but his aggressive behavior made him too dangerous to keep. They couldn't sell him to another farm knowing he might hurt someone, and they couldn't bear the thought of sending him to slaughter. So Frederico remained in his reinforced pasture, a prisoner of his own trauma, growing more isolated and angry with each passing day. It was on a crisp October morning that these two isolated souls would first encounter each other in a way that would change both their lives forever. Jayne had convinced her mother to take her on a walk along the rural road that bordered the Williams farm, something she did whenever the world of school and therapy became too overwhelming for her sensitive spirit. Sarah Parker had learned to recognize the signs when her daughter needed solitude and nature to recharge her emotional batteries. Jayne would become restless, unable to focus on her schoolwork or sign language lessons, and would stand at their kitchen window staring longingly at the open fields and forests that surrounded their small town. "Come on, sweetheart," Sarah had said that morning, noting Jayne's wistful expression. "Let's go for one of our special walks." They drove to the quiet country road that wound past several farms, including the Williams property where Frederico spent his days in isolated fury. It was Jayne's favorite route because she could watch the animals without the pressure of human interaction, finding peace in observing creatures who seemed to understand the world differently than the people around her. As they walked along the gravel road, Sarah chatting quietly about the changing colors of the autumn leaves, Jayne suddenly stopped walking. Her head tilted in the way it did when she was processing sounds that others couldn't quite identify, and her eyes focused intently on something beyond the fence line. In the distance, barely visible through the morning mist, was Frederico. The massive bull was standing motionless in the center of his pasture, his head raised as if he was listening to something only he could hear. For a moment, girl and bull seemed to be aware of each other across the 100 yards that separated them, connected by something invisible but powerful. Then Frederico began to move. Not the aggressive charging that farmhands had learned to fear, but a slow, purposeful walk directly toward the fence, where Jayne stood frozen in fascination. His massive hooves made no sound on the soft grass, and his dark eyes never left the small figure watching him from the road. Sarah noticed her daughter's stillness and followed her gaze to see the enormous bull approaching the fence. Her first instinct was protective panic. She had heard the stories about Frederico's dangerous behavior, and the sight of him moving toward her daughter triggered every maternal alarm she possessed. "Jayne," she said urgently, reaching for her daughter's hand. "We need to move away from the fence. That's not a safe animal." But Jayne didn't move. She stood transfixed as Frederico reached the fence line and stopped just a few feet away from where she stood. The massive bull lowered his head and looked directly at her with an expression that Sarah had never seen in any animal. It was curiosity, mixed with something that looked almost like recognition. For several long moments, the mute girl and the furious bull regarded each other in perfect silence, two damaged souls recognizing something familiar in each other's isolation and pain. What do you think Jayne sees in Frederico that others have missed? Can this silent girl connect with the raging bull in ways that no one else has been able to? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because what happens next will challenge everything the town of Cedar Valley believes about communication, healing, and the power of pure, innocent love. What happened over the next 30 minutes along that quiet country road would become the most talked about event in Cedar Valley's history, challenging everything the community thought they understood about communication, connection, and the mysterious ways that wounded souls can recognize and heal each other across seemingly impossible barriers. Sarah Parker watched in growing amazement as her daughter and the massive bull continued their silent communion. Frederico had positioned himself as close to the fence as physically possible, his enormous head lowered to Jayne's eye level, his dark eyes focused intently on the small girl who showed no fear despite his legendary reputation for violence and aggression. Jayne slowly raised her small hand and placed it flat against the fence, directly in front of Frederico's massive nose. The bull's response was immediate and startling. Instead of the aggressive snorting or threatening posture that farmhands had learned to expect, Frederico gently pressed his muzzle against the fence where Jayne's hand rested, as close to touching her as the barrier would allow. "This is impossible," Sarah whispered, fumbling for her phone to record what she was witnessing. "He's supposed to be dangerous. Tom Williams told everyone in town to stay away from this bull." But Jayne seemed to understand something about Frederico that the adult world had missed. Moving with the careful deliberation that characterized all her interactions, she began to sign to the bull using the same gentle hand movements she used to communicate with her family. Her fingers spelled out words like gentle, friend, and safe, her face showing the intense concentration she usually reserved for her most important conversations. Frederico watched every movement of her hands with rapt attention, his ears forward in the posture that animal behaviorists recognize as deep interest and trust. When Jayne finished signing, the massive bull did something that made Sarah gasp audibly. He made a soft, rumbling sound deep in his chest, almost like a giant cat purring, a sound of contentment that none of the Williams family had heard from him in over 2 years. "He's talking to you," Sarah realized, her voice filled with wonder. "Somehow you two are having a conversation." The interaction continued for nearly an hour, with Jayne using a combination of sign language, gentle gestures, and patient stillness to communicate with Frederico in ways that transcended the barriers of species and spoken language. The bull responded to each of her communications with soft sounds, careful body movements, and an attentiveness that suggested he understood not just her gestures, but the emotional intent behind them. If this incredible connection between Jayne and Frederico is touching your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We share amazing stories of human-animal bonds like this every week, and trust me, what happens next will leave you speechless and restore your faith in the power of pure, unconditional love. Word of the unusual encounter spread quickly through Cedar Valley's tight-knit community. By evening, Sarah had called the Williams family to describe what she and Jayne had witnessed, and Tom Williams drove out to the fence line to see for himself whether the stories could possibly be true. What he found changed his understanding of everything he thought he knew about his dangerous bull. Frederico was standing calmly at the fence, and when Tom approached, the bull showed none of his usual aggressive posturing. Instead, Frederico seemed almost disappointed, as if he was waiting for someone specific who wasn't coming. "I've never seen him like this," Tom told his wife Betty that evening. "It was like he was looking for that little girl. When he saw it was just me, he walked away, but there was no anger in it. He just seemed sad. The next morning, Jayne convinced her parents to return to the fence where she had met Frederico. This time, they brought Tom Williams with them, curious to see whether the previous day's interaction had been a fluke or the beginning of something unprecedented. Frederico's reaction to seeing Jayne again was immediate and joyful. The massive bull trotted to the fence with an enthusiasm that made the ground tremble beneath their feet. But when he reached Jayne, his movements became gentle and careful, as if he understood that his size could accidentally harm the small girl who had somehow reached through his walls of anger and pain. Tom Williams watched in amazement as Jayne began what could only be described as a therapy session with his traumatized bull. Using sign language, gentle touches through the fence, and an intuitive understanding of animal psychology that defied her young age, Jayne seemed to be helping Frederico process emotions and trauma that 2 years of professional intervention had been unable to address. "She's not just communicating with him," Tom observed to Sarah. "She's healing him. Look at his posture, his breathing, the way he's holding his head. This is the Frederico I remember from before the lightning storm." The breakthrough moment came when Jayne did something that made every adult present hold their breath in terror and amazement. Without warning or explanation, she slipped through the fence rails and walked directly toward Frederico, her small arms outstretched in the universal gesture of a child seeking a hug. Sarah's scream of alarm was cut short when Frederico's response defied every expectation and fear. The massive bull, who had been considered too dangerous for trained farmhands to approach, carefully lowered himself to the ground, making himself as small and non-threatening as a 1,900-pound animal could possibly be. Jayne walked up to Frederico and wrapped her tiny arms around his enormous neck, burying her face in his black and white coat, while the bull remained absolutely motionless, barely breathing, as if he understood that this moment was precious beyond measure and must not be damaged by careless movement. For several long minutes, the mute girl and the traumatized bull held each other in perfect silence, two damaged souls finding healing in a connection that transcended every barrier that had separated them from the world around them. Tears streamed down the faces of every adult witness as they realized they were seeing something that would change their understanding of communication, empathy, and the power of innocent love to heal even the deepest wounds. When Jayne finally released her embrace and stepped back, Frederico remained on the ground, his massive head lowered in what could only be described as gratitude. The bull who had raged against the world for 2 years was calm, peaceful, and showing signs of the gentle nature that trauma had buried beneath layers of pain and anger. Tom Williams wiped tears from his weathered cheeks as he watched his bull stand up slowly, careful not to alarm the small girl who had accomplished what teams of professionals had failed to achieve. 37 years I've been working with animals, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But I've never seen anything like what just happened here. News of Jayne's miraculous connection with Frederico spread beyond Cedar Valley, attracting attention from animal behaviorists, veterinarians, and media outlets fascinated by the story of a mute child who could speak to a traumatized bull in ways that professional therapists couldn't match. But for Jayne, the attention was secondary to the relationship she had formed with Frederico. She had found in this misunderstood bull a kindred spirit who shared her experience of being isolated by circumstances beyond their control, and together they had discovered that the most profound healing often happens in silence, when hearts speak directly to hearts without the need for words. Can this incredible bond between Jayne and Frederico help both of them heal from their respective traumas? How will the town of Cedar Valley change after witnessing such a powerful demonstration of empathy and connection? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because the final chapter reveals a transformation that will touch your heart and prove that sometimes the most profound healing happens through the simple act of being understood. 3 months after Jayne's first embrace with Frederico, the transformation in both the mute girl and the once furious bull had become so profound that Cedar Valley had evolved from a quiet farming community into a pilgrimage destination for families seeking hope, healing, and proof that love truly could work miracles that medicine and science couldn't explain. The changes in Frederico were visible to anyone who had known him before Jayne entered his life. The massive bull who had spent 2 years in isolated rage now spent his days peacefully grazing near the fence line, always positioning himself where he could see the road that Jayne traveled during her daily visits. His aggressive bellowing had been replaced by gentle lowing sounds that he made only when he spotted Jayne approaching, calls of joy and recognition that had become the sweetest music the Williams family had ever heard. "It's like having our old Frederico back, but better," Betty Williams told reporters who continued to visit the farm. Before the lightning storm, he was gentle but distant. Now he's gentle and connected, like Jayne awakened something deeper in him than just his old personality. He's become wise in a way that I've never seen in an animal. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a veterinary behaviorist from Oregon State University, had been studying Frederico's transformation for 6 weeks, documenting changes that challenged everything the scientific community understood about trauma recovery in animals. His cortisol levels have normalized completely, she explained to a gathering of veterinary professionals. His muscle tension patterns show no signs of the hypervigilance that characterized his post-trauma behavior. Most remarkably, he's displaying nurturing behaviors typically seen only in animals who are actively parenting young. But the most profound transformation was happening in Jayne herself. The shy, withdrawn girl who had struggled to connect with her peers was blossoming into a confident young communicator whose gift for understanding animals had attracted attention from around the world. Her parents had been contacted by dozens of families with traumatized pets, therapy animal programs seeking her insights, and researchers hoping to understand how her unique combination of silence and empathy created such powerful healing connections. Sarah Parker had initially been overwhelmed by the attention, worried that the spotlight would be harmful to her sensitive daughter. But Jayne had surprised everyone by embracing her role as a bridge between human and animal worlds, using her remarkable gift to help other creatures who had been written off as hopeless or dangerous. The breakthrough that made international headlines came when the Cedar Valley Elementary School invited Jayne to visit with their therapy dog program. Max, a golden retriever who had been trained to help children with reading difficulties, had become aggressive and withdrawn after being attacked by another dog, making him unsuitable for his therapeutic work with vulnerable children. Within minutes of meeting Max, Jayne had identified the source of his trauma response and began the same gentle, patient communication process she used with Frederico. Using sign language, careful body positioning, and an intuitive understanding of animal psychology, she helped Max process his fear and rediscover his natural desire to comfort and protect children. The session was recorded by school officials, and the footage of Jayne silently healing the traumatized therapy dog went viral on social media, bringing international attention to the quiet Oregon town and the mute girl whose gift transcended every barrier that typically separated humans from animals. Jayne doesn't just communicate with animals, observed Dr. Martinez. She seems to understand their emotional states at a level that allows her to provide exactly the kind of reassurance and healing they need. It's not training or conditioning. It's pure empathic connection that somehow bypasses the need for spoken language. The Williams farm had become an unofficial animal rehabilitation center, with families bringing traumatized pets from hundreds of miles away, hoping that Jayne's mysterious gift could help their beloved animals recover from abuse, accidents, or behavioral problems that traditional veterinary care had been unable to address. Frederico had appointed himself as Jayne's assistant and protector during these healing sessions. The massive bull would position himself nearby whenever Jayne worked with other animals, providing a calming presence that seemed to help traumatized creatures feel safe enough to trust again. His transformation from dangerous isolate to gentle therapy partner had become an inspiration to everyone who witnessed his journey. The most touching development came when Jayne's gift began to extend beyond animals to her human relationships. The confidence she had gained through her success with Frederico and other animals had given her the courage to reach out to classmates who had previously intimidated her with their chatter and noise. Using the same patient, observant approach that worked with animals, Jayne began to help other children who struggled with communication, confidence, or social anxiety. Her sign language became a bridge that allowed hearing children to experience communication in new ways, and her calm presence seemed to reduce anxiety in classmates who had previously been too shy or fearful to participate in group activities. Jayne has become our unofficial school counselor, explained Principal Lisa Thompson. Children who are having behavioral problems or emotional difficulties naturally gravitate toward her. She has this way of making everyone feel understood and accepted, even without speaking a word. The transformation had extended to the entire Parker family. Michael and Sarah had initially worried that Jayne's differences would limit her opportunities and relationships, but her unique gifts had opened doors they never could have imagined. Universities were offering scholarships for future study in animal psychology. Therapy animal organizations wanted her involvement in their programs, and families around the world were reaching out for her help with their own animal companions. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in Jayne's own sense of purpose and belonging. The girl who had once felt isolated by her inability to speak had discovered that her silence was actually a superpower that allowed her to hear and understand things that others missed. Her muteness, which had once seemed like a limitation, had become the foundation for a gift that was bringing healing to creatures who had been abandoned by traditional approaches. On a crisp spring morning exactly 6 months after their first meeting, Jayne and Frederico shared a moment that perfectly captured the miracle of their relationship. As Jayne sat in the pasture reading a book, Frederico positioned himself to provide shade for her, his massive body creating a protective shelter while she studied. When a photographer from National Geographic captured the image of the tiny girl reading peacefully in the shadow of the gentle giant, it became one of the most shared photographs of the year, symbolizing the power of understanding, patience, and unconditional love to transform even the most damaged relationships into sources of healing and hope. People ask me what Jayne's secret is, Sarah Parker reflected during a recent interview. The truth is, there's no secret technique or special training. Jayne succeeds because she sees animals and people, not for what's wrong with them, but for who they really are underneath their pain. She doesn't try to fix or change them. She just accepts them completely, and somehow that acceptance creates space for healing to happen naturally. The story of Jayne and Frederico had become more than just an inspiring tale of an unlikely friendship. It had proven that the most profound healing often happens not through complex interventions or expensive treatments, but through the simple act of being truly seen, understood, and accepted by another living being who recognizes the beauty and worth that trauma had temporarily hidden. As the sun set over Cedar Valley, painting the Oregon sky in shades of gold and pink, Jayne and Frederico maintained their daily ritual of quiet companionship. Two souls who had found in each other proof that love really could conquer fear, that understanding could triumph over isolation, and that sometimes the most powerful healing happened in perfect silence, when hearts spoke directly to hearts in the universal language of compassion. What does Jayne and Frederico's story teach us about the power of acceptance and understanding in healing trauma? How can we apply their approach to our own relationships with those who seem difficult or unreachable? Share your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this remind us that every being carries both wounds and the capacity for healing. And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see past the pain to the love that lives underneath. A mute girl hugged the furious bull. What happened next left the whole town in tears.